Hi, I'm Ethan. My own brother stood up in a packed courtroom and called me a thief, a liar, and a parasite who stole from our dying father. All of it was a lie, but in that moment, the lie felt more powerful than any truth I could offer. Have you ever been through something like this? A moment where the person you should trust the most becomes your worst enemy. Before I tell you what happened when the judge finally looked at the evidence I brought, that sealed folder that would change everything, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't. Want to miss what happens when a lifetime of lies finally comes crashing down in a federal courtroom? The main conflict was laid bare right there in that sterile, intimidating room. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and cheap coffee, a stark contrast to the multi-million-dollar estate we were fighting over. On one side was my brother, Mark, looking every bit the successful heir in his tailored suit. On the other side was me, feeling like a ghost in my own life story. The fight wasn't just about the sprawling house in that wealthy DC suburb where we grew up. It was about our father's legacy. Mark claimed I had manipulated our dad, a decorated military officer, in his final days to forge a will that left me everything. He was painting a picture of me as a villain, and for a while it seemed like everyone was buying it. Mark's performance was flawless. He had always been the eloquent one, the one who knew how to charm a room. As he spoke, he'd gesture with his right hand, making sure everyone saw the gold Rolex on his wrist, our father's watch. He had driven to court in our father's pristine Mercedes, parking it brazenly at the front. He wasn't just using these things, he was wearing them like a costume, a symbol of the inheritance he believed was rightfully his. Every time the light caught the watch, it felt like a punch to the gut. It was a constant, glittering reminder that he had already taken possession of our father's life, and now he was coming for his honor, and mine along with it. This wasn't just a private, family dispute that had spilled into court. Mark had made sure it was public. He'd orchestrated a smear campaign, feeding carefully crafted stories to anyone who would listen. I'd get calls from distant relatives, old family friends, all repeating the same lines, that I was a coward, who had never amounted to anything, a parasite who had leached off our father his whole life. They'd heard I was living in the house without a job, taking advantage of a sick old man. Each phone call, each sympathetic but judging look from a neighbor was another turn of the knife. Mark was systematically erasing who I was and replacing it with a monster of his own creation. Sitting there listening to his lawyer repeat these accusations, a cold numbness spread through me. It was a strange feeling, a mix of white-hot anger and a deep, hollow sadness. This was the same brother I'd built forts with in the backyard of that very house. The same brother who taught me how to throw a baseball. Now he looked at me with a hatred so pure it was terrifying. It wasn't about the money anymore, not really. It was about the fact that he was willing to desecrate our father's memory, to twist his final wishes into something ugly and transactional, all for the sake of greed. The betrayal was so profound it felt like it was rewriting my own past. I remember one Christmas years ago, when we were just kids. Dad had given us each a simple, engraved compass. He told us it was so we would never lose our way, not just in the woods, but in life. He said our integrity was our true north. I still had mine tucked away in a drawer. I wondered if Mark even remembered his. Looking at him now, so confident in his lies, I realized he hadn't just lost his compass. He had willfully smashed it to pieces. The man sitting across the aisle wearing our father's watch like a trophy was a stranger to me, a hollowed-out version of the brother I once knew. Our father was not a man who could be easily fooled or manipulated. He was a retired colonel, a man who had commanded loyalty and respect through quiet strength and unwavering honor. He saw the world in black and white, duty, integrity, sacrifice. The idea that I, his quiet, reserved son, could have somehow tricked him into signing away his legacy was absurd. He was sharp until the very end. He knew exactly what he was doing, and more importantly, he knew his sons. He knew Mark's hunger for status and wealth, and he knew my silence. He knew the reasons for it, the weight of the promises I was forced to keep. Back in the courtroom, the judge's voice was a low drone, a backdrop to the storm brewing inside me. The lawyers exchanged papers, their movements crisp and practiced. But I couldn't focus on them. My eyes were locked on Mark. He would occasionally glance my way, his expression a mask of contempt and pity. I could feel the weight of everyone's stare, the jury of our family and peers judging me based on the fiction he had so expertly woven. In their eyes, I was the guilty one, the ungrateful son, the quiet one, who must have something to hide. They had no idea how right they were, but not in the way they thought. My lawyer, a good man who believed in me, leaned over and whispered, "Just stay calm, Ethan. We'll get our turn." I nodded, but I was barely listening. My hand rested on the worn leather briefcase in my lap. Inside was a single sealed folder with classified markings. It felt heavier than the entire estate, heavier than all of Mark's lies combined. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a reckoning. I wasn't there to fight fire with fire. I was there to honor a final promise to my father. A strange sense of calm washed over me. The truth didn't need to be shouted. It just needed to be seen. And soon everyone in this room would see it. Mark's lawyer began, his voice smooth and practiced, painting a picture of my father as a frail, confused old man in his final months. He used words like undue influence and cognitive decline, legal terms that felt like sterile weapons designed to strip my father of his dignity. I sat there listening to this stranger describe the last days of the strongest man I ever knew as a period of weakness and vulnerability. It felt like a second death. They weren't just trying to take a house from me. They were trying to rewrite my father's final chapter, turning a story of honor and quiet strength into a cheap drama about a senile old man and his greedy, manipulative son. Every word was a calculated lie, and the silence in the room made it feel like gospel. I watched my brother, Mark. He played his part perfectly, the dutiful, grieving son. He'd dab at his eyes with a handkerchief, then let his hand rest on the table, making sure that gold Rolex, our father's watch, was visible to everyone. He would sigh at the appropriate moments, shaking his head with a look of profound disappointment aimed directly at me. It was a masterful performance. He had always been the actor in the family, the one who could charm his way out of any trouble. Now he was using that talent to dismantle my life, piece by piece, right in front of an audience of our own family. The contempt in his eyes was so real, so potent, that for a split second I almost believed his version of the story myself. It was a chilling testament to how completely he had severed the bond we once shared. My mind kept flashing back to Dad, just 6 months before he passed. We were in his study, the room filled with the scent of old books and leather. He was going over geopolitical maps, his mind as sharp as a tack, debating foreign policy with the same intensity he had as a colonel. This was the man Mark's lawyer was describing as mentally incompetent, a man who could pinpoint troop movements on a satellite image, but supposedly couldn't understand his own will. The absurdity of it was staggering. He wasn't a victim. He was a commander until the very end. He had made his choices with a clear mind and a heavy heart, fully aware of the consequences. He knew Mark. He knew his insatiable appetite for the symbols of success. And he knew me, the quiet son who carried the weight of a different kind of duty. The worst part was looking out into the gallery. I saw my Aunt Carol, who used to bake me cookies as a kid, now looking at me with cold pity. My father's old bridge partners, men who had known me since I was born, wouldn't meet my gaze. Mark had done his work well. He had spent weeks poisoning the well, calling everyone with his carefully crafted narrative of my betrayal. I was the black sheep, the failure who had swooped in at the end to take what the successful son deserved. I could feel their judgment like a physical force pressing down on me. In this room I wasn't Ethan, their nephew, their friend's son. I was a caricature, a villain they had been taught to despise. The loneliness was suffocating, a silent, airless chamber built by my own brother's words. Then Mark's lawyer called a former housekeeper to the stand, a woman I remembered being kind, someone who always had a smile for me. But her face was a stony mask now. She recounted a story, her voice trembling with practiced sincerity, about how she'd overheard me, arguing with my father, demanding money. It was a complete fabrication, a scene plucked from a bad soap opera. I had never argued with my father about money in my life. We argued about politics, about the state of the world, but never that. I felt a wave of nausea. Mark hadn't just lied himself. He had coerced others into lying for him. He was building his case on a foundation of rotten wood and paid for testimony, and the structure was holding up under the weight of the court's solemnity. A hot, useless rage burned in my throat. I wanted to stand up and scream. I wanted to call them all liars, to expose the whole charade for the ugly, greedy theater it was. But then I'd feel the memory of my father's hand on my arm, his voice weak but firm. Honor isn't loud, son. It's what you do when no one is watching. You hold the line, you keep your word. The promise I made to him on his deathbed was a shield, but it was also a cage. It forced me into this agonizing silence, making me appear guilty. I had to let Mark throw every punch, knowing I held a truth that could end the fight in an instant. But the time wasn't right. My father's orders were clear, only when there was no other way. This was a test of discipline he had prepared me for, my entire life. During the lunch recess, the injustice became even more stark. I sat alone on a hard wooden bench in the hallway, eating a stale sandwich from a vending machine. Across the cavernous marble hall, Mark was surrounded by our relatives. He was the center of attention, accepting hugs and sympathetic pats on the shoulder. He was laughing at something one of our cousins said, the sound echoing in the sterile space. He was holding court, solidifying his position as the victim, the righteous heir. They were all on his side, a loyal army he had recruited with whispers and lies. Seeing him there, so comfortable in his deception, so celebrated for his cruelty, was more painful than any lie told on the witness stand. He hadn't just taken my inheritance, he had taken my family. When we returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The housekeeper's testimony had landed. You could feel it. The judge now looked at me with an expression that was less neutral, more skeptical. My own lawyer seemed to be fighting an uphill battle, his objections met with impatient sighs. I felt the tide turning against me, the slow, inevitable pull of a verdict built on falsehoods. Mark seemed to sense it too. He sat up straighter, a smug, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He was winning. In his mind, the house, the money, the status, it was all but his. He had successfully painted me as a parasite, and now he was just waiting for the court to officially fumigate his life of my presence. The injustice was no longer just an accusation. It was becoming a fact in the eyes of the law. My lawyer did his best on cross-examination, pointing out inconsistencies in the housekeeper's story, but the emotional damage was done. She played the part of a loyal employee, scared of me, loyal to my father's true memory. It was a disgusting, brilliant move by Mark. He knew that in a family dispute, emotion often carries more weight than fact. He was selling a story, and it was a simple one. Good son versus bad son. It didn't need to be perfectly logical, it just needed to feel right to people who wanted a simple answer. And my silence, my refusal to engage in the mudslinging, was being interpreted as guilt. Every moment I honored my father's final wish, I was digging my own grave in that courtroom. The final phase of the hearing began. The lawyers were making their closing arguments. Mark's attorney summed up their case, his voice ringing with conviction as he called me a disgrace to my father's decorated name. He gestured towards Mark, the grieving son who only wanted to protect his father's legacy from a cowardly and conniving brother. Then, in a move that was pure theater, Mark asked the judge if he could speak directly. The judge surprisingly allowed it. Mark stood up, his face a mask of righteous anger and sorrow. He turned, not to the judge, but to me. His eyes locked onto mine, filled with a venom that I had never seen before, a hatred that seemed to have been simmering for a lifetime. He pointed a finger at me, his hand trembling with either rage or adrenaline. The room fell completely silent. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. "You were always a disappointment," he spat, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "He gave you everything, and you gave him nothing back. You never served. You lied to our father about who you are, and then you stole this house from him when he was too weak to fight back." The words hit me like physical blows. He wasn't just making a legal argument anymore. This was a public execution. He was stripping me of my name, my honor, and my relationship with my father in front of everyone. The injustice was complete, laid bare for all to see. In that moment, I knew this was it. This was the point of no return. This was the moment my father had warned me about. A dead silence fell over the courtroom. It wasn't just quiet. It was a void, a vacuum created by the sheer force of Mark's hatred. His words, "You never served," hung in the air, thick and poisonous like smoke from an explosion. For a long, stretched-out moment, nobody moved. The judge's hand was frozen halfway to his gavel. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard. In that silence, I didn't feel broken. I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. The kind of calm a soldier feels just before the chaos begins. My father had warned me this day might come. He had told me what to do. And Mark, in his blind rage, had just given the final order himself. This was the line. This was the moment where holding back was no longer an option. My brother stood there, chest heaving, his face flushed with a sense of triumph. He had finally said it, the one thing he believed was my greatest shame, and he had done it in the most public way possible. He glanced over at our relatives in the gallery, seeking their approval, their confirmation that he was the rightful heir, the true son. As he lowered his arm, the light from the tall windows caught the gold of our father's Rolex one last time. It gleamed, a little victory beacon on his wrist. He thought he had won. He thought he had delivered the final killing blow that would sever me from our family and our father's legacy forever. He had no idea he had just handed me the weapon to end the entire war. The judge finally broke the spell. His gavel came down with a sharp crack that made everyone jump. "Order," he boomed, his voice echoing in the suddenly too quiet room. His face was a mask of thunderous disapproval, not at me, but at Mark. "Mr. Harris, you will control yourself, or I will have you removed and held in contempt of this court. Is that understood?" Mark, looking slightly deflated, just nodded and sank back into his chair. Then the judge's hard, impatient eyes turned to me. They weren't sympathetic. They were demanding. He was waiting for my defense, my denial, my emotional outburst to match my brother's. The entire room was waiting for me to fight back, to yell, to cry, to do something, anything. My lawyer, a good man named David, leaned in close, his voice a frantic whisper in my ear. "Ethan, for God's sake, say something. Tell them it's a lie. We can sue for slander. We need to respond right now." He was right, from a legal standpoint. My silence was damning. Every second I sat there unresponsive was another nail in my coffin, another person in the room concluding that Mark's accusations must be true. Why else wouldn't I defend myself? But I just shook my head slightly, my eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table in front of me. I could hear my father's voice, weak but clear from his hospital bed. "Let them make all the noise they want. Son, true honor doesn't need to shout. You just hold your position until it's time to act." I finally looked up, not at the judge, but directly at my brother. I saw the smug satisfaction in his eyes, the look of a man who had finally vanquished his lifelong rival. But underneath it, I saw something else, a deep, hollow emptiness. He had torched our entire family history, desecrated our father's name, and for what? A house with a big lawn and a car he could show off to his friends. He had traded his soul for symbols. He had won a battle against a ghost he had created in his own mind, because the brother he was fighting against never really existed. And seeing that pathetic, empty victory on his face, a wave of pity washed over me, extinguishing the last embers of my anger. That was the mini turning point. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about duty. It was time to end this. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back. The sound of its legs scraping against the polished floor was unnaturally loud, a jarring shriek in the tense silence. Every head in the room snapped towards me. My lawyer grabbed my arm, his face a mixture of confusion and panic. "Ethan, what are you doing? Sit down, let me handle this." He thought I was about to snap, to lunge at my brother or storm out of the courtroom. Mark himself tensed up, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. He had expected words, not action. This wasn't part of his script. For the first time all day, he looked like he wasn't in complete control of the narrative he had so carefully constructed. I placed my hand gently on David's and pushed it away. I gave him a look that I hoped conveyed what I couldn't say. "Trust me." Then I stood up to my full height. I didn't look at Mark or my family. I focused only on the judge, who was watching my every move with a sharp, analytical gaze. I took a moment to straighten my suit jacket, a simple, almost mundane gesture that felt incredibly significant. It was a gesture of composure, of discipline. It was what my father would have done. I was not the hysterical, cornered animal Mark had painted me as. I was a son about to carry out his father's last command. The room held its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. My hand went to the worn leather briefcase at my feet. It wasn't a fancy designer brand like the ones Mark's lawyers carried. It was a simple, functional case my father had given me years ago. The quiet, solid clicks of the two latches opening echoed through the courtroom. Everyone's eyes were glued to that briefcase, as if it held the answer to everything. I reached inside and pulled out a single, thick manila folder. It was sealed with heavy-duty tape, and stamped across the front in bold red ink were two words that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Classified. It wasn't. A legal document. It was something else entirely. Something from a different world. A world of silence and shadows that had no place in this bright, orderly courtroom. Without a word, I began to walk. My footsteps were measured even. Each step on the marble floor was a steady, rhythmic beat, counting down to the end of my brother's fantasy. I walked past the lawyers' tables, past the court reporter, my eyes never leaving the judge's bench. I could feel Mark's stare burning into the side of my head. I could sense his confusion turning into a dawning, sickening dread. This wasn't a move he had anticipated. In his world of bluffs and boasts, a silent, irrefutable truth was a foreign concept. He had built his entire case on my perceived weakness, on my silence, and he was about to discover that my silence wasn't empty. It was full. It had been guarding something. I reached the judge's bench. It was raised high, a fortress of dark, polished wood. The judge looked down at me, his expression unreadable, a mixture of stern authority and raw curiosity. I didn't try to speak. I didn't offer any explanation. I simply held out the folder. After a moment's hesitation, he reached down and took it from me. His fingers brushed against the red classified stamp. I met his gaze for a second, holding it, letting him see the exhaustion and the resolve in my eyes. Then I gave a slight, respectful nod, turned around and walked back to my seat. My part was done. I had delivered the message. Now the truth would have to speak for itself. As I walked back to my seat, the silence in the room was so absolute, it felt like a physical pressure against my ears. Every eye was on me, 100 tiny lasers of judgment and confusion. But for the first time, I didn't feel their weight. I felt light. I had carried that folder, that truth, for so long that setting it down on the judge's bench felt like shedding a lifetime of armor. I sat down, folded my hands on the table, and waited. My lawyer, David, looked at me as if I'd just grown a second head, his mouth slightly agape. Across the aisle, Mark was whispering furiously to his attorney, a smug, dismissive smirk still playing on his lips. He thought it was a trick, a desperate, pathetic bluff. He had no idea what was coming. He still thought this was his game, played by his rules. He was about to learn that some rules are not meant to be broken. The judge stared down at the folder for a long moment, his expression one of pure, unadulterated annoyance. He was a man who clearly did not appreciate courtroom theatrics. He picked it up with 2 fingers, as if it was something distasteful he'd found on his shoe. I could see him preparing a lecture, a stern reprimand for wasting the court's time with such a dramatic, unprofessional display. He sighed, a heavy, impatient sound that echoed in the stillness, and looked directly at me with a glare that promised a swift and painful lesson in contempt of court. He clearly believed I had just sealed my own fate, handing him the final piece of evidence he needed to rule against me. In his mind, this was the final act of a desperate man, and he was not impressed. He was ready to bring the hammer down, and my little stunt was just going to make it fall harder. With a look of weary obligation, he broke the seal. The sound of the thick tape ripping was like a gunshot in the silent room, making several people in the gallery jump. He pulled out the first sheaf of papers, his eyes scanning the top page with a practiced, dismissive speed. Then he stopped. His eyes darted back to the top of the page, reading it again, slower this time. A deep frown line appeared between his eyebrows. It wasn't a frown of anger anymore. It was a frown of intense concentration, of disbelief. He lifted the page closer to his face, his lips moving silently as he read. The air in the room shifted. The certainty of a moment ago began to evaporate, replaced by a thick, humming cloud of uncertainty. Something was wrong with the narrative. The story everyone had been told was starting to unravel right there in the judge's hands. I risked a glance at Mark. The smirk was gone. He was leaning forward, his hands gripping the edge of his table, his knuckles white. He was trying to read the judge's expression from across the room, his own face a mask of confusion. His lawyer was still whispering to him, but Mark wasn't listening. His entire focus was on that bench, on that folder. The gold Rolex on his wrist seemed to have lost its luster, now just a piece of metal on the arm of a man who was rapidly losing control. He had built his entire case on a foundation of my perceived weakness and his own fabricated strength. He had controlled every word, every accusation. But this was something new. An unknown variable had been introduced into his perfect equation, and you could see the panic starting to set in as he tried to solve for it. The judge slowly placed the first document down and picked up the next. His transformation was stunning. The bored-irritated bureaucrat was gone, replaced by a man who was now completely, utterly engrossed. His posture had changed. He was sitting bolt upright, his shoulders squared, reading with a focus that felt like it was drawing all the energy in the room towards him. He flipped through several pages, his expression shifting from shock to a kind of grim, quiet respect. He wasn't just reading a legal document anymore. He was reading a history, a life, that had been deliberately hidden. At one point, he looked up from the papers, not at me but over my head, towards the American flag that stood in the corner of the courtroom. It was a brief, almost imperceptible glance, but it said everything. He understood. Then he found my father's letter tucked at the very back of the file. It was handwritten on my father's personal stationery, the familiar, strong script a stark contrast to the typed government forms. The judge read it slowly, his face softening for just a moment. I knew what it said. It spoke of a father's pride in one son's silent sacrifice and his profound, soul-crushing disappointment in the other's loud, empty ambition. It was a final testament, not just about who should get the house, but about what our father truly valued: honor, not wealth; duty, not status. When he finished the letter, the judge's face hardened again, but this time the cold fury in his eyes wasn't directed at me. He lifted his head and stared directly across the courtroom. He looked at my brother, Mark, and it was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. That single glance from the judge was the blow that finally shattered Mark's composure. It was a look that stripped away all his lies, his tailored suit, his stolen watch, and left him exposed for what he was, a greedy, dishonorable man. The color drained from his face. I could see a fine sheen of sweat break out on his forehead. He looked from the judge to me, his eyes wide with a dawning, sickening horror. The trap he had so carefully set for me had just snapped shut on him. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to his lawyer, perhaps to the judge, but no sound came out. He was a performer who had forgotten his lines, standing on a stage that was collapsing beneath his feet. The power in the room had not just shifted. It had reversed with the force of a tidal wave, and he was being dragged under. The judge carefully placed my father's letter back into the folder and closed it. The quiet thud of the cardboard flap hitting the folder was a sound of finality. He didn't slam it. He didn't need to. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the courtroom, looking at my aunt, at my father's old friends, at the faces of the people who had so readily believed my brother's lies. He wasn't a judge in a simple probate case anymore. He was now the guardian of a secret that was far more important than any family fortune. He was the custodian of my father's honor and my hidden truth. The room remained completely still, everyone waiting for the verdict they thought was coming. But they were all about to learn that this was no longer about a will. It was about to become a federal matter. Without taking his eyes off Mark, the judge reached for a small black button on the side of his console, hidden from the view of the rest of the room. He pressed it. Nothing happened for a second, and then a small, discreet red light began to glow on his desk. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, calm, and carried an authority that chilled the air. It wasn't the voice of a civil court judge. It was the voice of a man giving an order that would not be questioned. He spoke into a small microphone I hadn't noticed before. "Marshals to my courtroom, immediately." The words were quiet, but they landed like thunderclaps, each one a hammer blow against my brother's carefully constructed world. This was it, the point of no return. A moment later, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 2 United States Marshals stepped inside. They weren't the usual courthouse security. These were federal officers, their presence immediately changing the entire dynamic of the room. They were tall, imposing figures in dark suits, their faces impassive, their eyes constantly scanning. They moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of serious business. The judge pointed a single finger towards the doors. "Seal this courtroom," he commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "No one enters, no one leaves. This is now a matter of national security." The marshals nodded, and one of them turned and locked the heavy doors with a loud, definitive thunk. We were all sealed inside the room, trapped with a truth that was about to explode. The judge's voice cut through the thick, suffocating silence. It was no longer the weary, impatient tone of a civil servant dealing with a family squabble. It was cold, hard, and resonant with an authority that seemed to come from a much higher place. "For the record," he began, his eyes sweeping over every single person in the room, lingering for a moment on my stunned relatives, "the documents presented to me by Mr. Ethan Harris are not part of this probate hearing. They are, in fact, declassified, records from the Department of Defense, and a signed, authenticated final letter from the late Colonel Harris. Due to the sensitive nature of their contents, this proceeding is now subject to federal oversight. What was said in this room today, particularly the accusations made by Mr. Mark Harris, has severe implications that go far beyond the distribution of property." The word severe hung in the air, a promise and a threat all in one. The small town drama of a family inheritance dispute had just collided with the weight of the federal government. He picked up the first document, a thick piece of cardstock with an official seal. "I am not at liberty to disclose the full nature of these records," the judge stated, his voice a low, serious rumble. "However, to correct the egregious and slanderous public record created here today, I will read a few selected, declassified citations." He cleared his throat and began to read. The words that followed were a language my family had never heard from me. "For extraordinary heroism, under extreme enemy fire, deep behind hostile lines, displaying a level of courage and silent professionalism that directly saved the lives of his entire unit." He read on, detailing dates and operations in vague, sanitized terms that still painted a brutal, vivid picture. With every word, he was dismantling the caricature Mark had built of me, the coward, the parasite, the failure, and replacing it with a truth so far beyond their comprehension that they could only sit there, mouths agape, in stunned, absolute silence. I watched my brother, Mark. The transformation was horrifying. As the judge read, the color drained from Mark's face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. His confident, smug posture collapsed inward, as if his very skeleton could no longer support the weight of his lies. He began to tremble, a slight tremor at first, then a violent, uncontrollable shaking that rattled the heavy oak table in front of him. His lawyer tried to put a hand on his shoulder to whisper something, but Mark flinched away as if he'd been burned. He was staring at me now, his eyes wide with a terror that was primal. It was the look of a man who realized he hadn't Just been caught in a lie, but had unwittingly stumbled into a minefield he never knew existed. The gold Rolex on his wrist was just a gaudy shackle now, a symbol of the shallow world he had sacrificed everything for, a world that was currently ceasing to exist around him. The shockwave rolled through the gallery, hitting my relatives one by one. I saw my Aunt Carol, who had looked at me with such pity, now cover her mouth with a hand that trembled. Her eyes were wide, filled with tears of what looked like shame. My father's old military buddies, men who had avoided my gaze all day, were now sitting ramrod straight, their faces etched with a dawning profound respect. They understood the language the judge was speaking. They understood the meaning of silent professionalism. They knew the kind of sacrifice it entailed. In a matter of minutes, I had gone from being the family disgrace to the keeper of a sacred hidden honor. Their judgment, which had felt like a physical weight just moments before, had vanished, replaced by a heavy, palpable silence of their own collective regret. They hadn't just misjudged me. They had betrayed the very principles my father and I had lived by. The judge set down the military records and picked up my father's handwritten letter. "And now," he said, his voice softening slightly, "a final statement from Colonel Harris himself, dated 2 weeks before his passing." He held up the letter for a moment, letting the familiar, strong handwriting be seen. Then he began to read my father's final words aloud. "To my son Ethan, I write this knowing you will only ever show it if your brother's greed forces your hand. I have never been able to say it aloud, but my pride in you is boundless. You chose a path of quiet, anonymous service, a path of true honor that asks for nothing and gives everything. You have borne the weight of secrecy and the misunderstanding of your family with a strength I have rarely witnessed. This house, this legacy is not a reward. It is a sanctuary, a place of peace you have more than earned. It is yours, unconditionally." The judge's voice cracked ever so slightly on the last word. He paused, letting the weight of our father's pride settle over the room before continuing with the second part of the letter. His voice hardened again as he read the words, "meant for my brother. As for Mark," he read, "I have watched his ambition curdle into a poisonous greed. He worships the symbols of success, the cars, the watches, the status, but has no understanding of the sacrifice that true success is built upon. He sees honor as a performance, not a principle. To leave him my legacy would be to betray everything I ever stood for. It would be a lie. He has chosen his own path, one paved with empty things. I pray he one day finds his way back, but my duty is to protect the honor of this family, an honor that now rests solely with you, Ethan." The words were a posthumous indictment, a final, devastating judgment from the one man whose approval, Mark, had craved his entire life. That was what finally broke him. Mark shot to his feet, his chair screeching backward and toppling over with a loud crash. "No!" he screamed, his voice a raw, ragged shriek of pure desperation. "It's a lie, a forgery. He's been planning this. He tricked him. He tricked all of you." He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face contorted into a mask of pathetic, impotent rage. It was the last dying gasp of his narrative, the final, frantic attempt to wrestle back control of a story that had spun completely away from him. The 2 U.S. Marshals, who had been standing impassively by the door, took 2 synchronized steps forward. They didn't draw their weapons. They didn't need to. Their silent forward movement was more intimidating than any threat. The entire room was frozen, watching the complete and utter self-destruction of a man who had, until 10 minutes ago, held all the power. The judge didn't even raise his voice. He simply looked at Mark with an expression of such profound disappointment and disgust that it seemed to physically push my brother back a step. "Sit down, Mr. Harris," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. "These documents were authenticated by my clerk through secure military channels the moment I received them. They are real. Your father's letter is real, and your testimony, as well as that of your paid witness, is perjury. Your public accusations against a decorated, active-duty, special operations soldier constitute a serious federal offense. You have not only slandered your brother and dishonored your father, but you have recklessly endangered national security. This is no longer a family matter. This is a criminal one." Every word was a nail being hammered into the lid of Mark's coffin. He sank back into his chair, not sitting but collapsing, a puppet with its strings cut. The judge's gavel came down, not with a crack, but with a solid, definitive thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. "In the matter of the Harris estate," he declared, his voice ringing with finality, "this court dismisses the plaintiff's claim in its entirety. The last will and testament of Colonel Harris is hereby upheld. The estate in full is awarded to Mr. Ethan Harris." It was over. The fight for the house was done, but the judge wasn't finished. He held up the folder, a silent testament to the deeper truths that had been unearthed. He looked at the marshals, then at my brother. The air grew thick with a new kind of dread, a sense that the scales of justice were only just beginning to balance, and that the price for Mark's lies would be far higher than a piece of real estate. The room was silent, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Furthermore, the judge continued, his gaze fixed on my brother, based on the evidence of perjury and the potential violation of federal law regarding the unauthorized disclosure of a covert operative status, I am referring this entire case to the U.S. Attorney's Office for immediate criminal investigation. He then nodded to the two marshals. "Take Mr. Mark Harris into custody." It was an order, not a request. Time seemed to slow down as the two imposing figures moved towards Mark's table. My brother just sat there, his mouth hanging open, his mind seemingly unable to process what was happening. He looked at his lawyer, at our relatives, at me, his eyes pleading for someone to stop this, to rewind the clock to a time when he was still in control. But no one moved. No one spoke. He had sown the wind, and now in the cold, sterile quiet of a federal courtroom, he was reaping the whirlwind. The sound of the handcuffs was shockingly loud, a sharp, metallic click-clack that echoed in the dead silence of the room. It was the sound of a life being irrevocably broken. The marshals were professional, efficient. They pulled Mark to his feet, his body limp with shock, and cuffed his hands behind his back. As they did, his arm was twisted at an angle, and the gold Rolex, our father's watch, slid down his wrist, glinting one last time under the fluorescent lights. It looked absurd now, a cheap, meaningless trinket on a man who had just lost everything that mattered. They began to lead him away. He didn't struggle, he didn't speak. He just walked like a man in a trance. As he passed my table, he finally looked at me, his eyes empty of hatred, empty of everything except a vast, hollow, and devastating understanding. I had won. But watching my brother being led away in handcuffs, I felt no triumph. Only the cold, heavy weight of a victory that felt exactly like a loss. After the marshals led Mark through the heavy doors, a thick, suffocating silence descended on the courtroom. It was broken only by the sound of my Aunt Carol sobbing quietly into her hands. The judge looked down at me, his face no longer hard but etched with a deep, weary respect. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice now just the voice of a man, not a symbol of the law, "you are free to go. The court will be in touch regarding the final probate paperwork. I am very sorry for your loss." He meant my father, but I knew he also meant my brother. I just nodded, unable to speak. I gathered my simple briefcase, stood up, and walked out of that courtroom without looking back at the family who had judged me. There were no triumphant words, no final glares. There was only the hollow echo of my footsteps on the marble floor and the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of a war I never wanted to fight. The legal fallout for Mark was swift and brutal. It turned out that publicly outing a special operations soldier, even by mistake, is something the federal government takes very, very seriously. He was charged with perjury, but that was the least of it. The U.S. Attorney's Office added charges related to violating national security protocols. The housekeeper who had lied on the stand for him was also charged with perjury. She took a plea deal almost immediately, her testimony against my brother becoming just another nail in his coffin. Mark's high-powered lawyers, who had been so smug and confident, were suddenly out of their depth, dealing with federal prosecutors who didn't care about family drama or multi-million-dollar estates. His tailored suits and fancy car meant nothing in the face of federal prison time. His world, built on image and status, had completely crumbled. The first time I walked back into the house, it felt different. The air was no longer thick with tension and grief. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was calm. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing along the back of my father's favorite armchair, touching the frame of a family photo from a time before the bitterness set in. This wasn't a prize I had won. It was a responsibility I had inherited. For months it had been a fortress to defend. Now it was just a home again. A quiet place where I could finally unpack not just my bags, but the heavy, invisible gear I had been carrying for years. I went into the kitchen, made myself a simple cup of coffee and sat at the table watching the sun set through the window. For the first time in a very long time, I felt like I could breathe. The phone calls started the next day. Apologies mostly, stuttering, shame-filled calls from cousins and old family friends who had been so quick to believe Mark's lies. The first was from my Aunt Carol. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. "Ethan, I'm so sorry that we had no idea. We should have known. Your father." I listened quietly, letting her pour it all out. I didn't yell. I didn't tell her how much her doubt had hurt. I just said, "I know, Aunt Carol, it's over now." I accepted her apology and the others that followed, but something had broken, a trust that could never be fully repaired. They were still my family, but a line had been drawn. They now knew there was a part of my life, a part of my father's legacy, that they would never truly understand. A week later, a representative from Mark's legal team called to arrange for the collection of his belongings from the house. They mentioned the Mercedes still parked in the driveway and asked about some personal effects, specifically mentioning our father's Rolex. I told them they could come get his clothes, but the car and the watch were part of the estate. Next day I had the Mercedes professionally detailed and sold it to a dealership. I took the check and donated the entire amount to a fund for Gold Star families. Then I took the Rolex, that symbol of everything Mark had wanted, and I mailed it to the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center with an anonymous note asking that it be given to a young soldier who had lost more than just time. I didn't want those things in my house. They were tainted by greed, and I needed to cleanse my father's home of that poison. My life didn't change dramatically on the outside. I didn't suddenly become a different person. The secret was out, but only within the sealed confines of that courtroom. To the rest of the world, I was still just Ethan Harris, the quiet guy who lived in his late father's house. But on the inside, everything was different. The weight was gone. I started working on the house, fixing the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom that I'd been meaning to get to, restaining the deck out back. Simple physical tasks that felt grounding. It was my way of making the house mine, not just by law, but by labor. I was putting my own sweat and care into the foundation, just as my father had. I was no longer a ghost in my own home. I was its keeper. One afternoon, while cleaning out a dusty box in my father's study, I found it. The simple, engraved compass he had given me when I was a boy. I held it in my palm, the metal cool against my skin. The needle quivered for a moment and then settled, pointing steadily north. I remembered his words, "Your integrity is your true north." I realized then that the house, the money, none of it was the real inheritance. The real inheritance was that lesson. It was the quiet strength he had instilled in me, the ability to hold my position, to stay true to my own compass even when the whole world was trying to tell me I was lost. That compass was worth more than any Rolex, more than any mansion. It was the one thing my brother had lost and I had managed to hold on to. I heard through my lawyer that Mark eventually took a plea deal. He avoided the most serious national security charges, but he was convicted of felony perjury and fraud. He was sentenced to 3 years in a federal minimum security prison. He lost his license to practice law, his reputation, and every cent he had spent fighting me. His life, as he knew it, was over. There was no victory in hearing that news. There was only a profound, hollow sadness for the brother I used to build forts with in the backyard. The boy who had somewhere along the way traded his compass for a broken watch. He had been so desperate to win our father's legacy that he had completely destroyed his own. Now, years later, the house is quiet. The ghosts of that battle are long gone. Sometimes I sit in my father's study, the room where he taught me about honor and duty, and I look out the window at the old oak tree in the backyard. I think about the two boys who used to play under it, and the two men they became. My life is not one of public glory or recognition. It is a life of peace, of quiet purpose. I honored my promise. I held the line. The truth, in the end, didn't need me to shout. It just needed me to stand aside and let it speak for itself. And its voice, though quiet, was more powerful than all my brother's rage and all his lies. It was the only voice that ever truly mattered. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-confidence, please share this video with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening. Looking back on it all, I realized the most important battles we fight aren't in a courtroom, and they aren't against other people. The real war is the one that happens inside you, in the quiet moments when you have to choose what kind of person you're going to be. It's easy to get loud when you feel wronged, to meet anger with more anger. But true strength, the kind my father tried to teach me, isn't about having the loudest voice. It's about having a quiet conviction, a moral compass inside you that holds steady even when the world is spinning out of control. It's about knowing your own truth so deeply that you don't need to scream it from the rooftops, you just have to live it. We all think about what we're going to leave behind one day. My brother thought our father's legacy was something you could wear on your wrist or park in the driveway. He thought it was a dollar amount in a bank account. But he was wrong. A real legacy isn't made of things you can touch. It's made of the principles you live by, the honor you protect, the quiet sacrifices you make when no one is watching. That's the inheritance that truly matters. It's not given to you in a will. It's a choice you make every single day. You choose to carry that honor forward, or you choose to trade it for something shiny and hollow. Family betrayal leaves a scar that never fully fades. It's a unique kind of pain, a wound that comes from the one place you're supposed to feel safe. But what I learned is that you can't let someone else's broken compass shatter your own. You can't control their greed, their jealousy, or the lies they choose to believe. All you can control is your response. You can choose to stay true to who you are, to hold on to your integrity even when it feels like you're holding it alone. The ultimate victory isn't in proving them wrong, it's in refusing to let their darkness extinguish your own light. In a world that never stops talking, we've forgotten the power of silence. We see it as weakness, as surrender. But sometimes, silence is the most powerful weapon you have. It's the discipline to hold your ground when every instinct is telling you to attack. It's the confidence of knowing that a lie, no matter how loud, eventually exhausts itself, while the truth just waits. My silence in that courtroom wasn't empty. It was full of respect for my father, full of the weight of my promise. It was a shield, and in the end it was the one thing my brother's noise couldn't break through. I won the house, but I lost my brother. There was no celebration, no feeling of triumph when that gavel came down. Because what I learned is that some victories cost too much. They leave you standing alone on the battlefield, surrounded by the wreckage of what used to be your life. The real win isn't about crushing your opponent. It's about walking away from the fight with your soul intact. It's about being able to look at yourself in the mirror the next day and recognize the person staring back. That's a victory no court can give you, and no one can ever take away. So, what I really want to leave you with is this. Find your own true north. Don't let the world tell you what success or honor should look like. It's not about the car you drive, the title you have, or the approval you get from others. It's about the quiet, unwavering integrity you carry inside you. That is your real worth. It's the one thing that will guide you through the darkest storms and the most painful betrayals. Your character is the story you are writing every single day, and you are its only author. Make it a story you're proud to tell. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight a silent battle of your own, please share it with someone who might need to hear that their quiet strength is more than enough. Subscribe for more stories about navigating life's toughest challenges and finding your own way. Thank you for giving me a space to share mine.